Digital media are very powerful for individual users. I think we can see every day that people vote with their feet. Every day there is a referendum which media we find most appealing and most useful, and most of us vote for digital media. This is broadly beneficial for most citizens. There are very few people under the age of 40 who would wish themselves back to a pre-digital media environment. It gives people access to more information, it gives them more convenient and compelling ways of accessing and engaging with that information, sharing it with others, commenting on it, and passing it on. That's all broadly very beneficial for society as well as for individuals. The flip side of this is that the rise of digital media has existentially threatened the business models that funded professional journalism in the 20th century. These were based on a low-choice environment where people had little to choose from, and high market power for news providers that meant that advertisers had very few other options to reach people. Now we live in a situation that's the opposite. People have a lot to choose from, and as a consequence, news publishers have very little market power over advertisers, so predictably they make much less money. So on the one hand, the digital media environment is very beneficial for citizens. It gives us access to more information, better ways of finding it, accessing it, using it. But on the other hand, the rise of digital media has also challenged some of the ways in which quality information was funded in the past. So in that sense, we have quite a paradoxical situation that's very good for us as citizens, but very challenging for journalists. Digital technologies enable a whole range of different forms of media content and media experiences, ranging from just the sharing of text and the posting of pictures in ways that are very recognizable from 20th century media environments, to wholly new forms like social media and the like that are premised on people connecting and opting into networks with other users on platforms that then rank and filter information at scale. These are entirely new experiences. Of course, they build on social networks that we know from pre-digital age as well, but the scale and scope of this and the pace at which digital technology can filter content and serve it to us as users is entirely unprecedented. This is a fundamental transformation in our societies. There's been a lot of concerns about what this would lead to. One of the central concerns is the idea that the phenomenon we already know from pre-digital media environments of echo chambers, where people end up living in media environments that only provide them with information that affirms their existing point of view, never challenges them, never force them to see things from a different perspective or see the other side. This fear around echo chambers that we know from pre-digital environments where people would sometimes only read one kind of news in the newspaper, for example. The fear has been that the ways in which algorithms filter content would lead to the creation of so-called filter bubbles where search engines and social media would only serve people more of the information that they have already shown that they're interested in. This is an important concern, is a very important question, and it's important that we continue to ask it. So far, most of the best available research suggests that in fact search engines and social media have the opposite consequence, that they lead people to more diverse information than they seek out of their own volition, a wider range of views, different perspectives, different ways of seeing the world than the things we seek out on our own. So this is what I call algorithmic serendipity, where in fact the technologies that could lead us to an ever narrower information diet turns out to in fact lead people to more and more diverse content. So we are seeing a very fundamental change in these years in how people find and access news and information. So if we think back to the early days of the internet, and especially to pre-digital environments, really the only way in which we got access to news, apart from if we overheard it at the pub or friends would tell us about it at home, is that we directly sought it out. So if I wanted to read a newspaper, I would pick it up. If I wanted to watch a television channel, I would turn it on. This form of direct access was also the early days of the internet. We would go to a website or perhaps to an app to get the news. But increasingly what we're seeing is a separation between the content of news and the channels of discovery, where people increasingly rely on various forms of platforms, initially search engines, then social media, now increasingly various forms of messaging applications and microblogging services to find and access information. So now that we have a separation between the content that still comes from news publishers and the discovery, which is increasingly driven by search engines, social media, and the like. Now, the ways in which these systems work is constantly evolving, but right now, most research suggests that for most citizens, these platforms drive more diverse news usage, so not the narrowing of information sources or information that some fear, but it's also clear that the very same platforms that broadly empower most citizens and help them find and access more news than they would otherwise and more diverse news than they would otherwise, is also leading some highly motivated partisan minorities into self-contained information cocoons, and is enabling some malicious actors to try to undermine the integrity of public debate and the flow of free information that sustains our democracies. Fake news is a very fashionable term. It's also a dangerous and misleading term. The term is dangerous because it plays to a perception in much of the public that much of the information that's produced by professional journalists is sensationalist and superficial and perhaps inaccurate. And the term fake news can conflate the imperfections and shortcomings of professionally produced news with the much more profound problem of false and fabricated information that is designed to mislead and manipulate individuals. So the term is dangerous because it leads citizens to conflate the difference between inaccurate journalism and actual false and fabricated information. It's misleading because much of what is often discussed under the rubric of fake news is neither fake nor news. It's not fake in the sense that it's often content that is actually factually accurate but taken out of context and willfully misrepresented to manipulate public debate or lead citizens astray or to make money for that matter. And it's not news because much of it is not really about journalism or the provision of information, but about the manipulation of public sentiment through various forms of fake accounts or bot networks or other ways of manipulating discussions to create the appearance of public opinion or the appearance of public engagement around certain issues. So many of these problems, of course, we have faced for a long time in society. There's always been poor journalism. There's always been examples of powerful people or for-profit organizations that try to mislead the public, whether for political gain or for commercial gain. And there's always been what we might think of as sort of bottom-up disinformation, where we as citizens, often in good faith, were sharing information that was factually inaccurate and or misleading. If I don't believe vaccines work, I will of course share that with friends of mine who have kids because I want to help them. I want to protect their kids. Only in that case, I would be sharing information that is factually inaccurate and misleading and dangerous. So bottom-up misinformation has always been with us. What we see today, however, is a sea change in the amount of this kind of content that is around. The development of digital media have made it easier to publish any kind of information, including disinformation. So the overall volume is growing, and in particular in cases where there are political motives, whether domestic or foreign, or for-profit motives to produce information, we see a larger amount of this. Now, we should be very careful not to overestimate, however, the scale and scope of this problem. The best available research on the scale and scope of disinformation in Europe would suggest that while a serious issue, and a serious issue for some parts of the population who are highly motivated to seek out disinformation because it affirms their existing beliefs or help them be part of communities that they identify with, for most of the population, people see very little of this, much, much less than they see of news from established news organizations and what they hear from established politicians. So in those contexts, if you will, disinformation is real, but it's a very small part of people's overall information diet. And I think we need to question sometimes the assumption that people are easily led astray by this information and focus more on whether people have access to credible information that they actually trust from a variety of different sources in society. There are two fundamental values that are in clear tension in the way in which digital media operate today, where one is our desire for highly personalized and tailored services that are convenient, that fit our needs, and that serve us content that we're interested in and advertising that might be aligned with things we're actually interested in. And then our interest in privacy and data protection. And GDPR is an attempt by the European Union to shift the balance away from an internet that has been premised on very large-scale data collection to enable the provision of highly personalized services with the potential risk that people were unaware of the degree to which their privacy was being compromised by large-scale data collection on the internet, and put more emphasis on protecting the privacy of individuals, ensuring that data that is collected is not misused, and first and foremost and most importantly, ensure that there is always clear and unambiguous consent to the kind of data that is being collected and the ways in which it's being put to use. The consequences of GDPR for news distribution and news provision is yet to be seen. We know that increasingly people expect the content they see on the internet to be personalized and tailored to their particular interests. And that personalization is premised on the collection of data. So if GDPR turns out to seriously undermine technology companies and media organizations' ability to collect data on individuals with their consent, as the GDPR rightly requires, it will also undermine their ability to effectively personalize content and thus lead people to see less relevant material and material is less appealing to them. The other side of this is the economic underpinning of the way in which information is provided online, which is overwhelmingly still reliant on advertising, and that advertising in turn is premised on targeting based on the collection of private information. And here again, the question is, what is the balance that will be struck between the commercial considerations that require some form of data collection and then the entirely legitimate and fundamental right of citizens to make sure that their privacy is respected and that their consent is secured before data is collected on them. And we are yet to see really how this is going to play out in terms of the digital advertising space, whether post-GDPR we're going to continue to see advertisers find that digital media and targeted advertising online is the most attractive platform for them and thus continue to move money into this environment to fund technology companies, but also, of course, importantly, the provision of journalism. We are working through these years, I think, a very large-scale sort of public conversation around the infrastructures of free expression and the private companies that provide much of that infrastructure. Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, and other companies like them. It's clear that revelations like the revelations around Cambridge Analytica's collection of data from Facebook and their retention and reuse of this data for political purposes provides an occasion for a public discussion around what kind of infrastructure is it we want for free expression, and what kinds of trade-offs are we comfortable with, and what kind of responsibilities do we expect the private companies that provide much of this infrastructure to take on, and how do we judge them when they fall short of honoring those responsibilities. And it's clear that while there's been no measurable effect so far on the overall use of Facebook of the revelations around the way in which Cambridge Analytica collected data and made use of that data, it's clear that it is one of several stories that is beginning to change many people's perception of the company and the way in which the company protects the privacy and interests of its users. Now, will Facebook be able to respond effectively and convince people that they are trustworthy stewards of their best interest? We will see. These are early days, and Facebook is clearly responding on a very large scale to these revelations. Whether they can convince users that they have their best interests at heart is an open question. Another side of this discussion is the way in which different generations perceive the media that they rely on. Facebook initially was a media primarily oriented for younger users. It's clear that over time, as it's become ubiquitous, it's now a platform for almost everybody with internet access. A very large share of the European population is using Facebook across all generations and all groups. And this is changing the perception for many younger generations of how they use this platform and the role they play in their life. So we are seeing people move away from Facebook, not entirely, but to move some activities out of this large platform to more specialized tools, whether messaging applications or photo sharing sites like Instagram, microblogging sites like Twitter or Snapchat and the like, to a wide variety of different platforms that they then use for different specialized purposes. So Facebook is still central, but we see people move out to all these other environments, in part because Facebook, through its growth, has become quite an unmanageable space for some of us, where we are connected both with close friends and more casual acquaintances, both with perhaps our parents as well as other members of our family, professional connections, people we have come across on holidays and like, and the environment of a social media platform where everything we do is, unless we control the privacy settings quite closely, is available to all these very different people, makes it a very difficult space to navigate socially. So we see this emphasis on quite sort of inoffensive content on Facebook, and people then moving more potentially controversial conversations out into more private spaces like messaging apps like WhatsApp and the like, where people can control more carefully who do I talk to about what, while we stick to the sort of the generally appealing, quite soft stuff on Facebook, baby pictures, what we had for dinner, our nice vacation, something we like or didn't like on TV last night. We see these more private and edgy conversations move to more private spaces where people can control who they talk to and what they talk about. It's really, really important to focus on the way in which political parties and political campaigns themselves have actively made use of the way in which our data as individual citizens is collected online, and the way in which it enables all sorts of different actors, whether advertisers or news organizations or social movements or interest groups, or in this case, political campaigns and political parties, to target their communications, to tailor their messages, and to reach people in a very sort of narrow way, if that's what they seek to do. These technologies are most developed in the United States and less developed in many other parts of the world. I would say there are several main reasons why this is so. First of all, in the United States, we have incredibly well-funded political campaigns that wage very high-stakes battle for the most important political offices in the world, the US presidency, for example, and thus are able to spend literally tens, sometimes more than tens of millions of dollars on building up their data infrastructures and their targeting capacities. There's nothing in Europe like this. So first of all, it's about money. The American campaigns are much, much more well-funded and are seeking every advantage in a very high-stakes game over who gets to occupy the White House. The second side of this essentially is a question of a history of individualized targeting, whereas in the US, because it's a two-party race and where turnout is often very low, the premium is very much in mobilizing your partisans. You win essentially by turning out your base, and every single vote will matter in a two-party first-past-the-post system. And again, most of Europe is very different from this. Multi-party elections, much higher turnout. So the emphasis is less on mobilization and less on individual targeting, and much more about the ways in which different politicians can convince the public that they represent a narrative that is appealing for the common good and for the identity and values of individual citizens. Finally, of course, there is a regulatory backdrop to this, which is that for a long time, even before GDPR, the traditions of data protection and privacy in Europe and the United States have been very different. In the United States, the governments themselves collect voter files that are made available to political campaigns with very detailed information that provides the backdrop, the spine of all this targeting online. That's not primarily about digital technology, really. It's about voter files that the state collects and make available to political campaigns. In most of Europe, political parties do not have access to this kind of data because the state does not collect information and make it available to political campaigns. And this means that the spine that enables the kind of fine-grained targeting we see in US campaigns is often not really possible to the same extent in Europe, where political parties don't have access to this kind of state-provided individual-level data. We're living in a period right now of tremendous change in how people use the media, where what we see essentially is a generational divide between several generations of people who fundamentally have grown up in a pre-digital environment, or like myself, have grown up with personal computers, but where the internet is something we encountered in our teens or late teens or early 20s, really. And then a younger generation who have grown up with digital media and who use media in a very different way from most of the rest of us. So for older generations, digital media are still primarily a supplement to forms of media use that they have been familiar with for most of their adult life. So people still watch television in large numbers. Some people still read print newspapers, and digital is a supplement. They use the smartphone and the computer as a supplement to ways of using media that they've been accustomed to for a long time. For younger generations, this is very different. Television is quite peripheral, print is entirely marginal, and almost all their media use is centered around digital media, in particular mobile media and platform-enabled media, search, social media, private messaging applications, and the like. And this is a fundamentally different media environment, where the content may still come from professionally produced news from established news organizations, at least some of it, whereas much of the rest of it is communication with people that individuals trust, their friends, their family, their colleagues, and the like. And the ways of discovery are much more shaped by algorithms than what we've seen in traditional media, so search engine rankings, social media rankings, and the like. But it's also clear that even the younger generation that's most familiar with these technologies, that for whom these seem most natural, are thinking about the portfolio, if you will, the mix of media that they want to use, where there are some environments in which we are entirely comfortable relying on professional journalists to make the judgment for us, and then we'll consume the information that's presented to us. There are some situations in which people are entirely comfortable saying, I will rely on a search engine or a social media platform to rank the content that I see. Either rank it actively if I enter a search query, or rank it passively when I open a social media app and just see what's there. But also that, in particular in contexts where people don't really trust the media and may not live in political environments that are very polarized and where discussions can be quite intense and people disagree, may not really trust the information that their friends and family share on social media, that younger people too are becoming very savvy and making decisions about when they actively seek out more controlled environments where they can have more private conversations with select groups of friends that they have more confidence in, and more confidence in the platform itself and the way in which it enables unfiltered communication rather than ranked communication the way that search and social does, or edited conversation the way that news media do. So we see people moving to these more private environments that are enabled by messaging applications, like for example WhatsApp, and have some of the conversations that matters the most to them there, even as, of course, they continue to also use websites and apps for news and to rely on search engines and social media. What we see with younger people is a move where people have grown up with relying on digital media and are entirely comfortable leaving some decisions to be taken by editors. Then they'll go to websites and apps for news and information that is selected by editors and reported by journalists. They will rely on ranking algorithms to make other decisions for them, whether they are typing in a search query to get a result or opening a social media app and looking at the things that are ranked by the social media platform, but also complementing these decisions with more curated and private conversations with select groups of people in environments where content is not ranked and filtered, and where you can more closely control who you talk to and what you talk to them about, and you can select the groups with which you want to have a private conversation. So in particular in countries where people may not trust the news media, or where political discussion is such that people may not want to rely on social media, where people will often disagree or share things that some people may not find trustworthy or credible or appealing. In particular in those countries, we do see, especially younger people, put more emphasis on these more private conversations that are enabled by messaging applications such as WhatsApp. News has always been a mix of things that were free at the point of consumption and then things that we paid for. So if you think back to a pre-digital media environment, if you turned on the radio or if you turned on the television, almost everything you see was free at the point of consumption and then subsidized either by advertising or, in the case of public service media, by collectively binding decisions where we all paid for it. And then there are other things you paid for. You paid for newspapers. With the exception of free sheet, you would pay either a subscription or a single copy sale. So we've always lived in a world in which there was a mix of free news and paid news. For the first 20 years or so of digital media, almost all the news that we came across online was free at the point of consumption. There was very little appetite to pay. Many news organizations were seeking to build a large audience and hoping they could monetize this through advertising to fund their news production. And it's only really in recent years that news organizations have begun to realize that because they have a relatively small share of people's attention online, and because they compete with large technology companies like Google and Facebook, who provide very cheap, precisely targeted, large-scale digital advertising to advertisers, their ability to generate advertising revenues are probably not as high as they had hoped to be, and are increasingly looking to see if they can convince people to pay for news. Now, this leads to this question of whether we're going to move towards a world in which we'll see a polarization between those who are willing to pay, who might get quality content, and then the rest of us who may not be wanting to pay, and then will be reduced to sort of a second-rate information, if you will. This is a real concern. We should remember again that there are many people who still make quality news available for free online. Both commercial broadcasters and public service broadcasters tend to make their news available for free. So it's not entirely a question of either you pay and you get quality, or you don't pay and then you get second rank information of poor quality. You can still get quality information for free online. But it is a real concern. Are we going to see this kind of polarization? I think the real question this asks for journalists essentially is that since we know that people are still willing to spend on media and spend on digital media, people in fact are often spending more money on media now than they did in the past. They pay for their smartphone, they pay for their data subscription, they pay for their broadband at home. The question I think for journalists is not only is there going to be information inequality as we move towards pay, that's an important question for all of society, but also for journalists specifically, why is it that many people are not willing to pay for journalism? Why is it that a lot of people do not feel that paying €5 or €10 a month is worth it for the work that journalists do? I think that's a question for the journalistic profession about what is the problem that journalists solve? What are the ways in which journalism create value for society and for individuals? How is it that it makes people's lives better? And I think we are seeing many really ambitious and exciting answers to that question from both legacy organizations and from startups of various sorts who are trying to start membership schemes or introduce paywalls or convince people to pay for their news in different ways. But it is a fairly fundamental question for journalism to think about. Not only will people pay for the things we did yesterday when we put them online, but to ask the question, what are the things that people might pay for tomorrow so that we can continue to do journalism and to hold power to account and inform the public? Digital media, on the one hand, empowers us as individuals to do more things more easily, more conveniently, in more compelling ways than we could in the past, including politics. If we want to engage in public discussion or in political affairs, digital media offer a whole slew of new and convenient ways of doing this that can then take us up a ladder of engagement to more substantial, hands-on forms of engagement than just liking something on Facebook or sharing it on Twitter or the like. At the same time, however, it's also important to keep in mind that digital media are disrupting many of the institutions that historically enabled us to take part in the political process. They are disrupting the structure of member-based political parties. They are disrupting the nature of member-based interest organizations. They are disrupting the business model of journalism. So digital media empower us as individuals, even as they disrupt many of the institutions we have inherited from the 20th century, and of course, have led to the formation of whole new entities, these private companies that operate much of the infrastructure of free expression in ways that are clearly very empowering for many of us as individuals, even as we are also increasingly growing dependent on them, as they organize more and more of our life, as we rely on them for more and more of the different things we do with media. And of course, they do it in ways that are not only empowering for us, but also hugely lucrative for them and their shareholders. It's clear that the question of media literacy and digital and information literacy is a question for every generation, not only for young people. In many ways, many of the issues we face in Europe today around the way in which people use digital media are often more pronounced among older people than amongst younger people. For example, the dissemination of fake news. We have many reasons to believe that older people are, in fact, more vulnerable to disinformation than younger people are. So media literacy is not a question of young people only, it's a question of every generation. Every generation needs to be equipped to make the best possible use of the media and the technologies that are at their disposal. I think there are sort of three key parts to this, of how we ensure that the European citizenship is equipped to make the best use of the technologies at hand. The first one is that we have to insist that we must live in an intelligible society in which every citizen has at least the potential opportunity to understand the basic operating principles of the technologies and tools that she relies on. This is a question of how ranking algorithms work. It's a question of what kind of data is collected and what use is being put to. It's a question of what the business interests and others are that organize the news that she will rely on. This is a question of intelligibility. The second thing, I think, is a question of the general implications of the rise of technology, where I think it's important to keep in mind, even as there is a lot of skepticism, rightly often, about the potential risks of technologies, that broadly the development of technology, and we know this well in Europe, we have much to be proud of in this area, is a story of progress, not uniform progress, not progress without downsides and risks, absolutely not, but a story of progress where it is not the case that we see new technologies replacing old technologies or workers being replaced by machines. No, it's a question of whether people with machines are better at doing what they're trying to do than people without. And broadly there, the answer is clearly yes. We as European citizens could do more with digital technology than we could without. And we need to see that potential, that optimism, and that opportunity as central to the way in which we educate ourselves and we educate coming generations. And then finally, I think there is a dimension of this that is not really specific to digital technology, but is a part of the broader issues we face in Europe today as societies, in particular probably in our political life, which is whether we in our legitimate and right focus on making sure that everyone was a critical and a skeptical citizen, perhaps have lost sight of the question of whether we also need to be affirmative. And that we need to keep in mind that it is probably as important that we help every generation, but of course particularly future generations, to ask all the hard questions. Can I trust this person? Can I rely on this company? Will this platform treat my data with the protection and privacy that I have every reason and right to expect? But also to affirm and make choices not only about what we don't trust, but equally important about who do we trust? Given all the imperfect opportunities available, who are the ones who are least imperfect for us? Who are the ones who, while not perfect, have our best interests at heart, who enable us to be who we want to be and form the kinds of societies that we want to form together in Europe and elsewhere, so that we are not only taught to be critical citizens, but also to say yes and to engage in public life and affirm what we want, not only what we are afraid of, but also what we are for.